Kinesiology 223, Chapter 20. Still talking athletic injuries and psychological effects therein. Now we're getting into psychological reactions to exercise and athletic injuries. There's four main areas that we have in the book, and one is emotional response, psychological relevance, other reactions, and signs of poor adjustment to injury. With sports psychology specialists, and athletic trainers, they've identified various psychological reactions to injuries. And if you've ever been injured or had a friend who was injured in athletics, I talked about it before. There's an identity that is tied to being an athlete. You have a particular skill that allows you to perform, and your identity is wrapped around that. And all of a sudden, you're injured, and you can no longer do that, and your identity goes away, and you have this identity crisis. So you'll have some people who will process this and it'll be a complete disaster for them and it'll be awful because they've lost their identity. But also, you have some people where they're kind of at the end of their athletic road and they are just done with their sport, but they can't bring themselves to leave the sport. And I saw a couple people in football do this, and it was like when they were injured, it wasn't catastrophic, but it was just enough to take them out. And they said, well, I think I'm done with this. And they quit, and they just were done because it was just enough to kind of push them over the edge and help them make that decision to no longer be involved with their sport. So, you can kind of frame this up in two sides of, or, two ends of the spectrum here, but it's a matter of how the person responds to the injury itself. So when we go down here to emotional responses, let me just click here. Exercisers and athletes who have become injured often follow a 5-stage grief response. And this is something I'm sure you've probably seen before. And it's denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. And it's rarely linear. It's not like you go right from denial to anger to bargaining to depression. They'll end up bouncing around a little bit in terms of like the grief response. And it's something where, if you've ever been injured, if you've ever had an injury in a sport, you've gone through these. Now, with the emotional responsive, man, I got to move around all over in this presentation. Within this, you have different responses for your athletes. And, your athletes have to process the fact that they're injured. And it takes them out of denial and it gets them more towards acceptance. And the process that you have is the person is carted off the field, walks off the field. They usually sit out the rest of the game. But majorly catastrophic injuries are taken right to the hospital. But usually with an injury, it becomes all right. You get done with the game, you go in, you change, then you go off to the hospital, or you go through physical therapy or athletic training, and they end up working with you to try to be able to get back to play. So return to play, RTP is many times referred to. So you have these main categories when we talk about emotional responses when you're working with an athlete who's been injured. So they've had their injury. It's the next day. They're either working with a physical therapist, they have to go to the doctor, or they're with the athletic trainer. They're first off kind of processing what happens with the injury, right? And you're injured, you break your foot, you're like, holy smokes, I broke my foot. What does this mean? What's going to happen, et cetera? And you're just kind of taking in as much information as possible to be able to come up with a strategy to move forward. But there's also the emotional upheaval that I talked about before. You have this identity crisis, and it's also coupled with like reactive behavior where you might have a person who, depending on how they are wired, they might lash out, they might be angry, they might be sad, and it could be just whipsaw in terms of emotions. And then it becomes like this positive outlook and coping, which can also be like a rationalization. But it becomes, here's how I'm going to beat this, here's how we're going to fix this, here's how I'm going to RTP and get back onto the field. But the big part of it is we're to break this out into these three buckets, and they're not exactly neat and pretty. But the injured athlete focuses on information related to the pain of the injury, awareness, extent of the injury, et cetera. How, you're asking questions like how bad is it, what's going on, et cetera. The emotional upheaval, I get myself dialed in here. The emotional upheaval and reactive behavior part of this, they realize that they're injured, they become emotionally agitated, perhaps going from being completely drained to feeling isolated to being disconnected. They might feel shock, anger, disbelief, etc. And then they accept the injury. This is the positive outlook. They accept the injury and deal with it and initiates positive coping efforts and good attitude to be able to, progress through the curve to RTP. And with the psychological relevance of this, and they have these 4 bullet points over here: perspective, emotion, coping, and relationships. Huge, absolutely huge, right? And as a coach, you need to facilitate some of this. Your athlete can't feel like they're sitting out on an island somewhere if they're injured. As a coach, you have to approach that athlete and say, "How you doing, Johnny? Are you doing all right? I heard you banged up your knee a little bit. All right, work with the training room. They'll get you back. If you want to come in, do film, whatever, we'll work on what we're going to do next with you. But for right now, just get yourself right, okay?" And that means a lot to an athlete. Absolutely. But the um, the research they present here, they talk about perspective. And perspective is some athletes saw sports injury as an experience that challenged their perspectives on life and in sport. And I agree with that because you have to overcome adversity both in sport and in life. And it becomes a matter of how you overcome those challenges. Some athletes discuss the dynamic changing nature of emotions and their increasing willingness to share their feelings. I agree with that. I don't think you need to have like the training room become a group therapy session because, when you get into the training room itself, everybody's nicked up to a varying degree. And to a certain extent, you're all in there for a reason and you're all going to have conversations about your injuries, etc. And it can be a very supportive environment, but it doesn't need to be a group therapy environment. I'll just put it that way. So with coping, some athletes thought about the meaning, if you will, concerning the importance of accepting the injuries. Like what they're saying here is there's validity to accepting the fact that you're injured and not denying it. And you get out of those stages that we talked about before of grief, where one of them was denial. You get that right off the table, and the ability to cope with an injury comes from acceptance of the fact that you are injured. And then when you have relationships, and this is very much like what I just mentioned about being in a training room, you have some athletes that you have that are injured. They're all in the training room together. You have these kind of relationships that are built while you're going through the process of going back to play. And within that, it can be a very supportive environment if done correctly. But I will also say that your athletes who are not injured can also provide a very supportive environment for athletes who may be injured, right? And it comes down to what is the culture on your team? Does the culture of your team and your athletic program foster these types of relationships to allow your athletes to communicate with one another? And when you talk about the fact that your athlete has this intense involvement with a sport and intense involvement with their own identity, and many of their friendships are basically their teammates, right? And what ends up happening is you have this emotional upheaval where they basically lost their identity, they've lost their relationship with their sport, and then they end up losing their relationship with their teammates and the camaraderie that they have out on the field normally, or in the practice environment is now gone. And so it's a complete identity crisis. And I like how you say it creates emotional imbalance because, they're losing their long felt athletic identities. And I agree with that in terms of watching people go through this. And so we talked about this in a previous chapter in terms of social milieu, and it is so true where you have athletes who just lose all of that association, and then they lose their social identity and their personal identity as well. So other reactions they note: identity loss, fear, anxiety, lack of confidence, performance decrements, and group processes. I'm just going to rip through these real quick, but we talked about identity loss already in terms of like you have a identity crisis when somebody's injured. Fear and anxiety. Part of the fear and anxiety is, will I ever be fixed? Will I ever be whole again? Will I ever come back to 100%? And it becomes a conversation of then once you've rehabbed that person and they're no longer in the training room environment, you get out to the practice environment, they have to walk before they run, and they have to run before they sprint, right? So they have to relearn some of the skills that they need for their sport, and they have to have this kind of overcoming of the fear and anxiety that something may happen, and that ties itself to the lack of confidence, where the lack of confidence itself, if you're highly competent in your sport and you're confident in your abilities and all of a sudden you're injured, in some regard, it takes away your confidence. And that confidence can also be whether or not you can actually perform the skills as you once did. And if you've been injured, sometimes you have to find ways to compensate to overcome that injury. But when we talk about being integrated back into play, you end up having this lack of confidence that also comes from a timeline that marched forward with your entire team moving forward to plan for one team, to plan for another team, to plan for another game, to plan for another game. And as a result, these different puzzle pieces get moved around and you're not part of it. And you just don't feel confident that you can fit back into the social milieu, as we noted before, or into the environment effectively. But you can, and as a coach, you have to be able to creatively and deftly negotiate that process to integrate your athlete back in. The other concern is performance decrements, meaning you have this missed practice time, you have this injury, and it's going to lower your ability to perform. At first, an athlete has to lower their expectation and be able to incrementally ramp back into full play. It's not like you leave the training room and you go right back out to 100% practice and game environment. Usually it takes a couple practices to get your footing back to be able to function at 100% yet again. And there's a little bit of an ego thing there where you have to be able to accept the fact that you just have to incrementally work yourself back. With the group processes, and I said it before, your team has been planning, time marches ahead. You've been planning for different teams that you're playing against. You've been planning for different games. And the group process that you have this cohesiveness, right, that happens as a result of that. And all of a sudden the person is out of that cohesive process and then they're integrated right back in. And again, it becomes a conversation of how you as a coach are integrating that person back into the equation to not disrupt your own cohesion, but also understand how you value that person coming back from being injured. And what I like about this is down here, you can't play for 2 months, might disrupt the smooth flow and teamwork that was developed through working together with the other 4 players. And sometimes that happens, right? That happens where all of a sudden one person goes out and you realize, wow, we have better chemistry with these 4 players than we did with these other 4 players. So maybe you find ways to bring that player back in, but it's in a different format or a different strategy or a different play call. Other reactions. Loss of personal identity. I've talked about that. It's especially significant to athletes who define themselves through sport. Absolutely. When you have a career-ending injury, you have to have some psychological care, or you have to find ways to redirect your energy. And I believe all this to be very true over here on the right-hand side of the screen. Even though you have very negative connotations with being injured, you can redirect them into positive growth. I mean, I had the example of injured my foot, blew my back out. I was out of football, and I ended up going into coaching. So I redirected my energy into a positive environment because I knew my playing career was over, but it allowed me to have my coaching career. When you are injured and you're out for a while and you come back, they note that you have this greater sense of appreciation for the sport, but also I would say you have a greater appreciation for your teammates as well because you miss those guys so much, or you miss your teammates so much. When you do the repurposing, sometimes it's a little bit of a challenge because you have to have an understanding of what you want to do with your time and energy. I knew I wanted to go into the coaching side of it. For somebody who might not be interested in coaching, they'll have to find another avenue on campus. Perhaps it's a business club, their academics. It could be any number of different things on campus, but you try to find a positive outlet for some of the frustration that they have and to allow those people to recreate or repackage their own identities. All right. Signs of poor adjustment. How in the world do people not have poor adjustment initially? Oh my God, everybody would. But when you have people who have difficulty in terms of overcoming an injury, you might want to take a few moments on page 498 to go over these and kind of take a look at some of these. You can even pause me right here and just read through these in terms of what people might be doing if they're having poor adjustments to injury. But I'm going to go ahead and branch off now and go to the next presentation because I'm just about out of time. All right, see you.